let's continue looking at how interests are articulated. Remember that interest groups are important in articulating interests rather than articulating the interests of a particular individual. They articulate the interests of more than one individual, of a group of people who share the same interests. So interest groups matter. Also, the relationship between interest groups and the government policy-making institutions matters. That's an important part of the political process. So the interest group system is important for the political system itself. And there are different ways in which the interest groups can relate to the government policy-making institutions, which is a way to say that there are three types of interest group systems in the world. There are pluralist systems, democratic corporatist systems, and controlled systems. Pluralist interest group systems, this is what characterizes the American political system. So this will sound the most familiar. In a pluralist interest group system, you have multiple groups representing a single interest. Group membership is voluntary and limited, and there's a clear separation between interest groups and the government. So, for example, think of how many different groups there are representing environmental interests. These groups compete against each other for members, money, and influence. Your membership in them is voluntary. You would never mistake them for a part of the government. Clearly, they are separate groups that lobby the government. So if you wake up tomorrow and you realize, I really care about the environment and I want to affect the political process, and you go to look for groups to join, you're going to find a lot of them, right? There are a lot of different groups working on environmental issues, promoting sustainability, reducing pollution, all that kind of stuff. There's a lot of different ones representing this interest. The membership is voluntary. You don't have to join, but if you want, you can write your check to the Sierra Club or whoever, and then they will take your resources, articulate on your behalf to the government. This is different than what the book calls democratic neo-corporatist interest group systems. That's a very messy name for a concept, and we could just shorten it to democratic corporatist if that's easier. In a democratic corporatist system, there's a single association that represents each interest. Membership is often compulsory and is universal. And groups are systematically involved in making and implementing policy. This is the type of interest group system you would see in a Scandinavian country like Norway or Sweden or Denmark. And to picture what a democratic corporatist system looks like, imagine that there was one group that represented business interests, one group that represented workers, one group that represented environmental interests. Each of those groups would have near universal membership. If you're a worker or a business owner, you are a member automatically of this interest group and you pay your dues to that interest group and they represent your interests. If you're a worker, then as a worker you are required to be part of this interest group. You pay your dues. They represent the interests. They articulate the interests of workers. Their widespread membership, because membership is compulsory, gives them a lot of clout. So when they go and lobby the government, when they sit down with the government officials, they're going to have a lot of power and they are going to articulate your interests as a worker very powerfully. And they do that. They work closely with the government to create policy. And then once the policy has been created and they've been part of the process of doing that, they offer their support, so that you don't have the government then making policy that interest groups are arguing against or are unhappy with because their interests were brought to the table and they were part of making that policy. So it's a very different type of relationship between government and interest groups in a democratic corporatist system like you have in some European countries in comparison to a pluralist interest group system like we have here. Finally, let's look at controlled interest group systems. This is how authoritarian governments do interest groups. If you are an authoritarian government, or if you look at any authoritarian government around the world, it doesn't really want to be challenged by a powerful group in society. So rather than having a powerful group and powerful groups articulating their interests or sharing in the policy-making process, you have groups that are controlled by the government and are used to mobilize support for government policy. So you would have a single group for each social sector. Membership is often compulsory. Each group is hierarchically organized. But rather than really articulating interests to the government, they serve a little bit of a different function, which is they exist to get the support of the workers for the government's policy preferences. A very different type of interest group than the others. The others are at least representing the interest. In this case, interest groups or controlled interest groups are less about articulating the interests of the people and more about mobilizing support for government policy. If interest groups are going to be influential, they have to have access to policymakers. And they can have access through legitimate and constitutional means, which you can think of as personal connections, or the mass media, or parties, or legislatures. Groups that have substantial resources, money, members, and status, can access policymakers through these legitimate and constitutional channels of access. There are also illegitimate and coercive channels of access, ways in which interests are articulated to policymakers. Things like riots or strikes or terrorism, which we think of as outside the political process sometimes, but riots and strikes and terrorism are ways of articulating interests. And groups go that route because they have to. Because they don't have the resources, the money to present to articulate their interests legitimately and constitutionally. We tend to think of that as bad when groups do that, but that is what brought democracy to Eastern Europe, to Tunisia and other places. Labor unions or other interest groups will work against the government by employing riots or strikes. And that brings up an important point, that the channels used are determined not only by the group, but also by the system. Democratic systems allow groups to articulate their preferences. Authoritarian systems, groups don't have that freedom to articulate their preferences, so they have to go the illegitimate, more coercive route. Here's a chapter, and we'll end this with this slide, which helps break things down a little bit and give some good examples between legitimate and coercive channels of action, and how the different types of interest groups that we've looked at previously might use each of those different types of channels, the legitimate channel and the coercive channel. I won't go through all that, but that's in your book, and I think reading through that helps not only understand how there are legitimate channels and coercive channels available to interest groups to articulate preferences, but also how those different types of interest groups, anomic, non-associational, institutional, and associational, can engage in each of these different types of actions. Okay, then I'll see you in the next video. Bye.